Anyone willing to help take notes in Etherpad? Thank you, Stuart. Oh, the blue sheets.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're gonna hand that. Those are the- Good.
I want to see the next map. Some ridiculous community design for the airflow or something.
Okay.
Will it have wings?
I guess it's time.
Yep.
Okay, good morning. This is the HOMENET working group. If you're in the wrong place, then now's a good time to leave. I'm Stephen Farrell. This is Barbara Stark. And this is your morning show. So there's the note well. I guess you've seen that a number of times. We have a Jabber Scribe and we have a note taker, thanks to both. This is our agenda. I'm going to take a look at that. That's posted to the list. So Michael Richardson's actually in another session at the moment. Hopefully he'll turn up in time, just at the right moment. If not, we might have a short pause while we try to find him. Anybody want to bash the agenda? No? Good. Ted said something, I couldn't hear it.
I'm just going to be really impressed if I go 30 minutes. But
Yeah, okay, so we didn't ask for 2 hours and we got 2 hours, but we don't need to use 2 hours. So, yeah. This is our administrivia. You should have all that. Draft status. Barbara, I guess you put this together, so.
I did. Wow, can't do it with my glasses or without. That's great. It must be Friday morning. So yeah, I mean, the main draft that we have that's active is the one from Ted on the simple naming. We have a number of, the HomeNet dot is getting really close, really close to being published, and that's great. The HomeNet profile, Babel profile, is now on the agenda for
The Babel profile, I guess, is last call's finished and Terry put it on the NIESG Chat at some point, or
yeah.
he's nodding, so yeah.
Right. So yeah, that agenda, the IESG telechat agenda, it's in May. So that's good. That's progressing. We do have these other drafts, working group drafts, that are hanging around. At some point, we'll have to decide what to do with them. And then there's the other stuff. Any comments on any of these? Good. Let's move on.
Okay. So I think you mean you, Ted? Ted?
And apparently this is the pink square.
all right.
I'm trying to give you the entirety of your pink square.
I appreciate that.
So I don't think the clicker is going to work, but just tell me to scroll forwards or not.
Okay.
It might. Did you plug it in?
Okay. Wow, this is very glary. So I'm here to talk to you about the simple net naming architecture. You've heard about this before. Next slide. Wow, how primitive. There was a bit of a hiatus for me, and not much has changed. But the changes that have happened have actually been pretty substantial. I took a look at the document after kind of a several-month hiatus from working on it and realized that it was really poorly organized and probably quite difficult to follow. I mean, of course, anybody here could probably parse it, but it's a lot of work to parse and it shouldn't be that much work. So I reorganized, and I think the new organization is better. I'm curious to know if other people think that's true also. I was a little rushed getting the document in before the deadline, and so there are some places where it says things that aren't correct. Sorry about that. That will get fixed in the future, hopefully the near future. So it's not the full architecture, and it doesn't require a full service resolver. And it needs some work on expanding the new sections that I added to when I reorganized. Because when I reorganized, what I found was that actually there was a whole bunch of text about certain things, and there was a lot missing on the other stuff. Next slide. Okay, so the new structure, just briefly, it's now structured based on the things that you need to do to make the HomeNet naming architecture work in your HomeNet. I don't know why that was mysterious, but it was. So it talks about how to get a name for your HomeNet, how to set up authority, like an authoritative server, how to set up resolution, being able to answer queries, how to publish names, which might seem like it's out of scope for simple, but I'll get to that. How to configure hosts, and how to set up trust. Next slide. So name is just a forward domain name for the HomeNet, and in the simple architecture, this is always home.arpa. I mean, you could go into the UI and change it to something else, but I don't know why you would. And when I say you could go into the UI, I'm speaking hypothetically. I don't actually know that you can do that. There's no support for delegating a global name. If you want your if you want your HomeNet to be ted.home or ted. It wouldn't be ted.home, but ted.com, example.com. If you want it to be example.com, you're not going to be able to set that up using the simple naming architecture, because the simple naming architecture doesn't really provide name service in the traditional sense. Next slide. So authority, every HomeNet obviously needs to have an authoritative DNS server. That's not as complicated as it sounds. In the simple HomeNet naming scenario, that's just a discovery proxy. So there's no stable storage, and it's supporting locally served zones. So home.arpa, fc.ip6.arpa is for ULAs, and then 10.ineditor, 168.192, and 116.17.ineditor.arpa, so that you can do reverse lookups. And obviously, it's not required to support any of those that aren't being used on the HomeNet, but that's what needs to be there. And it'll also answer for any of the other locally served zones. I'm not sure, I know that's not an exhaustive list, but I can't think off the top of my head what the other locally served zones are, but it has to answer for them too. Next slide. That'll be fleshed out in the document. So name resolution. So we need obviously something listening on port 53 that will answer questions that any host on the local wire asks. That could be a DNS proxy. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could just be forwarding DNS queries to whatever the correct resolver is upstream. It could be a caching resolver, so it could be doing full service, like recursion and stuff like that. But the simple HomeNet naming architecture certainly doesn't require that. I don't think it forbids. It doesn't say anything about it right now. I don't think it will forbid that, and I'm curious if anybody thinks it should. The key feature is that it has to support diversion of locally served zones. So this is sort of as we were talking about split horizon and DNS ops. So this is split horizon for your HomeNet. the ability to all those locally served zones that I mentioned on the previous slide to resolve those locally and not actually use the authority records that you might find if you went to .ARPA for those zones. Next slide. Publication. So the idea is that services need to be able to publish information about the service they provide and how to reach them, and manage the lifetime of that information. Now, for discovery proxy, that's pretty straightforward. They just, they answer MDNS queries, and the lifetime of those MDNS queries is basically however long the thing sits there answering MDNS queries. As soon as it stops, at some point, not too long after that, the existence of the server will no longer be apparent. Next slide. Host configuration. So it needs to get the IP address of a resolver to your host so that you can actually talk to the resolver. And there's basically 3 methods that I know of to do that. If anybody else has other suggestions, please let me know. I don't think that we should be requiring DHCPv6 stateless, not stateful, but stateless. But we certainly could do it that way. If you have an IPv4 only host, you're pretty much stuck using DHCPv4. But I think the mandatory thing is going to be RA. And actually, it's probably, I guess DHCPv4 is probably mandatory too, because otherwise we don't support IPv4 only hosts. Let's see. So once the host has an IP address, it can discover. So a little bit of background: RFC 6763 describes a way that you can advertise service discovery in DNS, so rather than using MDNS, and that's how simple HomeNet naming works. So in order to use that, you need to be able to go look in the zone to find what your local zone is, so that you can do service discovery. And there's a process called discovery of browsing domains in RFC 6763 that describes how to do that. In the discovery relay document, there's actually some text that says if you get an MDNS query to do browsing domain discovery, you'll answer it. So we don't normally do MDNS as a service on the HomeNet, although it's present on the local wire if something's doing it. But this particular thing we do because it's a single packet exchange, whereas if you wanted to go look up discovery browsing using DNS, it takes longer. Yes?
So John Border asked, do we need to do anything with deprive/port 853?
I don't know. I guess that's an interesting question. I think the right answer to that question is not for me to make a definite statement, but to say, let's talk about it. So if he could bring that up on the mailing list, I'd love to have a discussion about it. I think that's a great question to ask. Next slide. Trust. So on a simple HomeNet, trust, you have to have some kind of trust. For simple naming, the only basis we currently have documented for or talked about for trust is that the thing is local, and it's not particularly trustworthy, but you can at least trust that it's the local thing. It'd be nice to have something better than that, but for now we're essentially relying on the local link. And my expectation is that the document, when it's done, will be relying on the local link. This is something the working group might want to think about, but I suspect that that's what we're going with. I have some ideas for how to do something better than that. I think those might go in the advanced HomeNet naming architecture. If people think that we need this in the simple HomeNet naming architecture, let's talk. Next slide. So speaking of advanced HomeNet naming architecture, so the idea when I proposed the simple HomeNet naming architecture was that we would have the simple HomeNet naming architecture, which would suck. Actually, no, it'll be awesome, but it's not as good as the advanced naming architecture. But they have to coexist. If you have a bunch of routers that implement the simple naming architecture, they have to work with routers that support the advanced naming architecture. In fact, I would say the most likely scenario would be that you'd buy a bunch of cheap routers and one expensive router, and the expensive router would do advanced HOMENET naming, and the cheap routers would do simple naming. And in order for that to work, the simple naming architecture has to actually support the advanced architecture. And I believe that means that we need to actually define the advanced naming architecture before we finalize the simple naming architecture. I don't think it has to be done. I don't think it even has to be adopted by the working group, but we need to have some sense of what we're doing so that we don't wind up producing something that doesn't actually help. So it's my intention to work on that between now and Montreal, and hopefully have something fleshed out that we can work with. Next slide. So next steps, aside from the advanced naming architecture bit, we need to flesh out the new sections that I've added to the simple naming architecture, assuming that everybody agrees that that was the right thing to do, reorganizing it the way I did. The authors so far have not thrown any tomatoes at me. I kind of did that unilaterally. We need to finish the security considerations section. And once we have a fairly complete version of the document, I'd like to get some review from the working group. That's you guys. I think before we actually go for last call, I'd like to have some working implementations, and Stuart and I are working together on doing that. I'm also going to try and stuff this into OpenWRT and actually into Tourist OS as well, because I have a Tourist at home, and make sure that it actually works. Once we feel like we actually achieved our purpose, then I think it would be nice to go to working group last call.
Michael Abrams, are you going to announce on the list when you have some code on OpenWRT to?
Yes, of course. Yeah, and actually, you were asking yesterday, I think, in DNSSD about whether this would be something that you could just sort of, add to your list of packages, and I agreed that I would make it so that you could actually add it to the latest. If you have the latest version of OpenWRT, the distribution running, then you'll be able to add a feed and just subscribe to that package, and you should be able to get HOMENET naming working.
I guess we can ask if anyone else in here is willing to try. I mean, we ask about people reading documents. Can we say people are willing to try code?
How many people in the room are running OpenWRT or something like it? Okay, that's a lot of hands. How many of the people who raised their hand would be interested in this code and running it on their home network or wherever they're running OpenWRT? Not as many hands, but a pretty good number. Great. So yes, we will be announcing that on the mailing list. Yeah, it would be great to get some feedback. Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Sullivan. So I wondered, actually, when I was reading this document, whether this was what you were doing, because it seems to me, like, first of all, the reorganization helped.
Right.
But it did seem to me that there was suddenly a kind of dependency path on the advanced architecture, which I thought was the opposite of what we what we decided to do when we decided to go for this simple thing. Because originally, as I recall, we decided the simple thing doesn't actually meet the architecture document that, the requirements that we had.
Right.
And everybody said, yeah, well, that's okay because it, this is the one that we can achieve.
Yeah.
And now it sounds like what you're saying is, but we're going to need to have at least a plan for the full-blown conformance to the original thing, which now seems like it's a blocker once again. And I don't care, and I agree with you that that the advanced thing would, in fact, or the complicated or whatever we're going to call it, is the that's the thing that actually satisfies what we said we were going to do, or ought to be. But it doesn't seem like it's removing a barrier anymore. So I'm just worried about that.
Well, so the motivation for the simple naming architecture was that a bunch of folks got up at the microphone about, I don't know, 4 or 5 IETFs ago and said, we don't want to implement anything that's complicated. So it wasn't actually that we didn't want to have an advanced HomeNet naming architecture. It was that we didn't want to be required to implement it. So the reason for splitting them out wasn't really to get rid of the dependency on the advanced architecture. It was to get rid of the requirement that every HomeNet router implement the advanced architecture.
Okay, so I remember that a little differently.
Okay.
I mean, you know, arguing about the past is one of the things that caused me to get divorced, so I'm not going to try to do it here. I have the impression that part of the reason people didn't want the really complicated thing was, oh, too complex to implement. Mm-hmm. And part of it was, it will take, 900 years to come to consensus on some of these things. And everybody was tired from the routing discussion. We didn't want to repeat that.
Right.
So I am nervous that if you actually need something like an agreement about the advanced naming, we're going to repeat that experience.
Right.
And it will not be good.
So what I said on the previous slide, maybe I didn't say it. Oop, nope. Related work. I don't need the working group to have consensus to even adopt the advanced naming architecture document. I just want to know what's going to be in the advanced naming architecture document with sufficient clarity that I know that we haven't left something out of the simple naming architecture document. And I think that's a lower bar than what you're worried about. Now, all right. Maybe I'm being unrealistic. Maybe it would actually be better if we actually finished the advanced naming architecture document before finalizing the simple naming architecture document, but that is not what I'm proposing to do. And that's a debate we could have if somebody wants to have it, but I'm not planning on having it if nobody's going to bring it up.
Bob Hinden, yeah, I agree with what Andrew said. I think tying this to an advanced naming document that's going to either never get done or taking forever, it's just blocking progress here.
Sure.
So I don't think that's the right way to do it.
Michael Abrams again. I just wanted to share one of the observations I've made in the last 2 years is that operators are now moving more and more into using OpenWRT and similar kind of distribution. So actually providing code with a very permissive license makes it a lot more likely that in a few years this can actually end up in shipping products that the operators have.
Right.
So compared to 3 or 4 years ago where everybody was penny pinching very constrained devices, this is no longer the case because you basically can't buy 8 megabyte memory chips anymore. So it's not a thing anymore.
Right.
You probably can, but it's like there is no reason to. So most of the devices that are shipping today have 256 megs of RAM and 64 megs of flash or even more. So this is less of a problem than it was 3 years ago when we were having the large discussion about how to keep down the footprint to the bytes. Can we optimize the bytes, please? This is less of a thing anymore.
I went out and looked about a year or two ago to see if it was possible to buy a Z80 still. Does anybody remember Z80s? Yeah. And it turns out you can. They still make them. They're very small. And the slowest one, I think, is 2 gigahertz or something like that. It's ludicrously fast. Like any program that you had that ran on a Z80 back in the day, it would finish before you hit return. So anyway, next step. So is that the last slide? That's the last slide. All right.
I have a question, not
okay.
as chair, and I'm just too lazy to go up to the microphone.
That's fair.
I love the reorganization, Ted, really did. It made things so much clearer. What I was thinking about was in the context of multiple routers, which of course is part of HomeNet's charter, and trying to understand what will be the interrelationships between the multiple routers, who's going to win, if there's multiple things delegating multiple things, how are they going to decide who does what? And if you have some that are HomeNet and some that aren't HomeNet. And I'm happy to think about that myself, but it's something that I was thinking about as I read through the draft, and maybe I'll try to put something together. But
that's a good point. We actually need a section in the document that talks about how HNCP works with this, because I think that's the answer. And
well, that's only if it's a HomeNet router, but
well, if it's not a HomeNet router, if it's not a HomeNet router, then the architecture doesn't apply to it. If you're talking about a situation where you have a HomeNet router and a non-HomeNet router, and which one wins, I think basically it's whoever controls the link wins.
But HNCP actually handled the case of it. You may have some things that are not HomeNet, And they kind of described what that happens. But anyway, I might do some thinking about this, but if you do thinking too, that'll be great.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, the good news is that I'm essentially on the sort of DNSSD / naming thing for the next while, next 6 months or so, full time. So the slow pace of work on this should stop. That didn't sound right. It should get less slow. So that's all I've got. If nobody else has any more comments, then.
So I had a couple of questions. How many people have read this version? Not so many. How many people have read a recent version? Slightly more. So yeah, we clearly need to get more feedback. Secondly, Ted, there was in the document there was a bunch of places where there's like I still have a bit of work to do, TBD kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It wasn't clear to me which of those were difficult and which of those were really just editorial from reading through it. So the question is, would it be possible to try and flag the ones that need more discussion?
I think that's
start a thread on those ones.
Actually, it might be good to just go through the document like one section at a time and have a list discussion on that section of the document. And talk about what the problems in that section are, or solicit, I don't think there are any problems. Does anybody disagree with that? And see how that goes. Because I agree, there are some things that are hard and there are some things that are easy, and it'd be nice to get feedback.
Julius Krabacek, I'm sorry if I repeat myself. It's very difficult, at least in my experience, or at least I'm not smart enough to see the problems in the document before I implement it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we've been through that before, and I think we did not quite agree. But I think it would be a very, very good thing to have a third-party implementation of this so that we can know whether there are any problems.
Yeah.
So somebody needs to do the work I did a couple of years ago for HNCP, doing an independent implementation in order to find out whether the document makes sense for a third party.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult to do unless the third party is actually implemented.
So are you volunteering?
No. I've done my job for HNCP.
Yeah, much appreciated too.
As you say in French, place aux jeunes. The next generation has to step in. Now I'm old and tired.
So do you have any ideas for who might be interested? Do you have any PhD students who might be interested?
That's not a PhD job. A PhD
Do you have any
job is
undergrads?
original research.
Do you have any undergrads who might be interested?
I'm not in... no.
Do you have any colleagues who, anyway? I absolutely agree with you. And if you know of somebody who's interested in doing this work, I would love to do it with them, or I would actually, it'd be better if I didn't do it with them, but I'd love for them to do it. So the problem is just finding somebody that wants to do that.
Only.
Yeah. Oop.
So, I mean, is this something that it would be tractable to kind of try and recruit somebody to do it at one of these hackathons, or are there too many bits to assemble?
There are a lot of moving parts in this. I mean, if you really wanted to do a serious implementation of it, you would have to implement the proxy that I talked about. You'd have to implement a DNSSD discovery proxy, and you'd have to implement a discovery relay. So there's a fair amount of code there. I mean, the discovery relay, like somebody who's really gung-ho could probably get one working in somewhere between a week and a month that would sort of limp along. Obviously, it would need some beating on to mature. But it's definitely not a hackathon level thing. I mean, that's not to say that, somebody could show up at a hackathon and assemble parts and probably come up with something, and that might still be instructive. But
So you said that you thought it might be useful if we had some sort of real deep dive discussion into the document. Would you think that it might be useful if we had some sort of interim call that was dedicated to this topic for like scheduled max of 2 hours, where we just deep dive into each section and discuss it?
well, the question is who would show up for that. I think, right,
Who would show up for that?
that's not
Okay, not
bad.
me.
I mean, these are some of the people
A
that I'd
call.
want to show up for it.
Like a
but-
phone call, guys? Okay.
Oh no, Zoom. You just use Zoom.
Okay.
But yeah, I think I'm gonna claim that actually it's probably going to work out better if we just do it on the mailing list, because
Okay.
it's a little bit more opportunistic then, like people can just respond when they have time.
Okay, that's fine. Thought I'd
Yeah.
throw it out there.
Thanks.
Okay, so I guess the plan then is you'll start some threads on the list about individual sections or topics from the document.
Yeah. I mean, maybe like as I'm going through the document, one a week or something like that, and see how that goes for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks.
And I guess the action is on myself and Barbara to hassle you to keep doing that.
Yes, that sounds like a plan.
Okay. Great.
Michael's here.
He is. Michael. So I'll be your slide scroller for the.
Okay. And you make us stand right up here next to you so we don't get trouble or something. Hi. Oh, I guess I can see this way. My name is Michael Richardson. You may know me from TV shows such as Anima and Brewski. I've been doing a lot of work across a couple of working groups between NetConf, Anima, and Sixtish in doing enrollment, what we've often called join, and we've stopped calling it join a little bit because it's confusing for some things that where you join other things in other places. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Brewski protocol. That's bootstrapping remote secure key infrastructure. And you can be assured that we came up with the acronym first. And how it might work in HomeNet or not work in HomeNet. So next slide, please. Apologies, the slide numbers just never seem to work for me. They always, the previous slide has 6 ones and this one has none. So a couple of slides about Anima. And I'm going to try to race through these a little bit quickly because I want to make sure we have time to talk about HomeNet issues. So autonomic network integrated model and approach. And essentially what it is it's a way to get rid of having to send people out to data centers to install equipment with serial consoles and stuff like this, such that you can really just for equipment above a certain size, but how small that is, we're here to discuss. You can ship it out and the equipment will discover your network and will join your network and join your domain and get a credential in your domain. And at the end of the day, you'll see it pop up as an icon in your NOC center, even though you've never touched the equipment. And so this is something that, as that human operators used to do through, quote, south interfaces, which often means a laptop plugged into that piece of equipment. And that's just something people don't want to do anymore for a wide variety of reasons. Next slide. So we have 3 basic pieces of the ANI, the autonomic network infrastructure. We have the secure bootstrap, which is Brewski. We have a secure and dedicated, essentially VPN, which is known as our autonomic control plane. And we have a generic signaling protocol known as GRASP, which is not unlike HNCP, but has a different goal in many ways and is more about the content of the negotiation than the transport of it. And we put them together and we get a usable system where we essentially get a management interface. What would have, in times past been a phone line over or some other out-of-band connection, which of course that's all disappeared. So it's only the internet. So if you don't have an out-of-band connection, then you have nothing to rescue the system. On top of this, we run what are called autonomic service agents. And if it sounds a bit like voodoo and hoping, I would say it is a little bit at this point. But the idea is that these are the things that go and configure things, like figure out that you need address space in a particular network, or that this particular installation was intended to be to serve residential customers and it should turn on DSL, PPPoE interfaces or something like that. That's the kind of thing it's supposed to be kind of intent-based. Next slide. So a little bit of what the autonomic control plane is essentially a VPN. It's an IPsec over IPv6 link layer addresses. We build a tunnel on top of that, and we actually run the Rolls Ripple protocol on top of that, which is a nice, simple, lightweight protocol that's not in use in routers otherwise. And one of the reasons to have a different one was because it being different, it wouldn't be subject to what vendors are already doing with something, and they get confused and mix their different VRFs around. So that was a little bit there. But also it's good at just relatively low impact throwing around /128s. We could have used Babel or Babel. I still don't know how to say it right. That was certainly a possibility as well. Next slide. So how do we bootstrap trust? So our assumption is that the devices come out of the box with a trust anchor linking them to the manufacturer. That is, if you wrote the code and made the ROM, you can put a public key in there for which the private key you, the manufacturer, control. Then the end user convinces the manufacturer that the device belongs to them, and the manufacturer issues what we call a voucher. So that's the piece that actually is across the 3 working groups we're using the same voucher format for between NetConf, Anima, and 6TiSH. And it's in a document called IETF Anima voucher, and I believe it's past IESG last call, and it's in the RFC editor queue. The device, the end result of the device now trusts the end user. So you think, well, why does the device need to trust the end user? I'm interested in trusting the device. Well, the thing is that each one of you decide what network you're going to, with your laptop, what network you're going to trust by clicking on the little Wi-Fi icon. You pull it down and you do something that you might have a certificate to be sure that it's Starbucks or IETF, but ultimately you, the operator, the human, make that decision. So a headless device or a device without a competent manager doesn't know how to do that. Go ahead.
Julius Krabacek, what happens if I buy a router at the flea market?
We'll come to that. That's a good question. And we don't have a complete answer, but we have a number of different answers. And unfortunately, some of it depends upon what the manufacturer wants you to do. So it is possible for manufacturers to forbid you to buy routers at flea markets, but it's also possible for systems to essentially, once it becomes the first owner's router, then the first owner essentially replaces the manufacturer's identity with theirs, and when they sell it to you, they become your manufacturer. At which point you, of course, receive the device and overwrite that again. So there's different models to do that, and we haven't said a specific thing, but we were very sensitive to the fact that we want to support resale. Okay. On the other hand, there are people that want to know that they haven't got a resale device. So there's a concern there. So it's in our stuff, and we can talk about it, but it's really a bit beyond what I want to talk about at this here. Next slide. So what is the problem? The problem is, how do I get that device onto the network? How do I get it essentially with a local credential in 802.1ar parlance, an LDEV ID? And what do I do this? So next slide, please. So why didn't we use EAP? People have asked us this all the time. Like, oh, that sounds like an EAP does. It says, yeah, and it does a great job if you're already a member of the domain. The problem is they're not a member of the domain at this point. And so you wouldn't even know which EAP network to use and which credential to use on that network. And so you get into an enrollment problem of there. So essentially, this is a wonderful thing, and it's great. And you know, once you have an LDEV ID, you can use this to get on networks, and it's all wonderful. But until you have that, it becomes a problem. And what we saw was that a lot of the people who were coming along talking about this were extremely confused about what the problem was. And it was clear that they were going to be confused if we tried to make an extension to 1X to do this, that we would have weird situations where things just didn't work. Secondly, it appears that architecturally, a number of switching equipment, just the concept that they would be in 1X client rather than an authenticator is too confusing to them. Okay, so we just said, you know what, we don't want to go that way. We're just going to step aside from all this. Next slide. So just a little bit more high level. I want to jump into a little bit of stuff pretty quickly. So as I said, we started with 3 working groups. We have 2 methods in 6TiSH, a minimal version, which is a 1-touch version, and a 0-touch version. And then we grew this yellow slide and this yellow group in the middle who wanted a bit from the 6TiSH side and a bit from the Brewski side. And so we have that. So then I put another box here, you know, let's have another member at the wedding party here, the red HomeNet group could have another story. So each of those boxes essentially is another sort of component, and we're mixing and matching them in different ways to make up this process. Next slide, please. So the essential thing is you start with a device. We call it a pledge. If you're a Animal House fan, you'll understand immediately why they're called that. But essentially, a pledge is someone who comes along and says, I agree to do everything that you tell me if you let me into your club. And they possess a certificate, and they come along some network. Next slide. So we have a couple of other terminology that I thought I'd throw here. So we have pledge. We have a proxy. Proxy is a joint proxy is a device that helps the pledge get online. And then we have a registrar. And we started using join instead of enroll. We started using enrollment instead of join because join had a different context for a number of people and a different meaning, and people got confused. Next slide. So it reaches out. IP link local, we actually have a grasp, multicasp that happens at link layer. It's not unlike the HNCP meetup messages, but it's slightly different, of course. And the pledge learns about the proxy. Next slide. And then you can see it's not, so maybe should have made a deeper line, but from the proxy, it goes through the pink lines to get to the registrar. So the pink lines are our ACP tunnel, and that's how it works. The proxy can be stateless, in which case there's enough information in the forwarding such that the traffic can get back without doing anything. This turns out to be pretty important in constrained networks because nobody wants to build a state table in a device that has only 128, neighbor entries or less. Sometimes 8. Or it can be stateful. So typically a bigger equipment essentially is running a kind of port forward, okay? And we use EST. So next slide. Now there's some stuff in there that we do. We have a provisional state in the TLS connection. We have both client and server certificates involved. Neither party can immediately validate them. And so we have a period of time when the connection is as we call it, provisional. And then what happens is that the manufacturer issues a voucher. So the voucher says, essentially, to the device, this network is your owner. So it connects, the pledge can validate the voucher because they have an anchor to the manufacturer. And the owner of the network has a public key that's been referenced by the voucher. So essentially created on, do we create it on as almost auditing, okay? We have a lot of text that decides whether or not you can write vouchers that expire because new devices may not have valid clocks. So then we have a nonce mechanism such that we can make sure that the vouchers are fresh in the absence of clocks. And then we have a whole bunch of other discussion about things like, I would like a non-expiring nonceless voucher because I want it for a device that I haven't taken out of the box yet, and I'm going to keep in a warehouse for 10 years and take it out later on, and I can't even know that the manufacturer is going to still be alive for me to get that voucher, so I'm going to get it now when I put it in the warehouse. So a lot of discussion around that stuff. And at the end of the day, everyone will be offline in a base in, Iraq or something, right? When you turn on the light bulbs. So we've had a lot of thought about how that works, and we have, I think, a reasonable set of mechanisms. We have to date explicitly excluded bearer vouchers where the pinned domain cert, which is the name of the domain owner, could be blank, right? So we've ruled that out for now because we think we don't want to do the security analysis of it, but there's some awfully good arguments why that would be a good thing. Next slide. Oh yeah, and so we're right now it's signed with CMS, okay, PKCS 7 if you like, but there's a version that'll come out that is probably going to be adopted by Anima this week that will sign with CBOR and COSI. Encode with CBOR, sign with COSI. So things that HOMENET does not need. The ACP is overkill. You don't need that. You're already building a network. You don't need to build a network on top of the network to build a network. That doesn't make any sense. Okay. In the Anima case, we're talking about equipment that is in multiple cities with many pieces of potentially dark fiber between them, and the goal is to have a management network that connects back to a NOC. HomeNet doesn't have that requirement, so you just use Brewski, okay? We have this intent-based policy that is a bit, I'm going to say, fairy dust. And we had a super working group which was going to make it all concrete, and yeah, it went where kind of predictably. But in any way, the intent, which is what is the network for, is a bit implicit in HomeNet. The network is for connectivity of the user. It's really, I mean, if you can say anything more complicated than that, I think you got it wrong. It's possible that the PKI is unnecessary, although I'm prepared to argue that point. You could just use the secure transport that we create. You could just use it to exchange PSKs if you wanted to. Network-wide PSK, that would be acceptable. I don't think it's a great thing, but you could do that. You could exchange raw public keys, although I'm not sure ultimately how that benefits you, because everyone has to have a complete set. And Brewski with the vouchers allows you to make that secure transport, allows you to keep it around as well if you need to. Next slide. What you probably want the vouchers. The vouchers allows you to basically have a statement from the manufacturer that this is your device. We have thought a lot about how you are going to buy a device at Future Shop or Walmart or Amazon, bring it home, and convince the manufacturer that it's your device. So we have these things that's called audit logs, and essentially what the manufacturer says is the first person that comes along to claim this device is its owner. Simple. And if someone else comes along and would like to claim that device, what they will find out is it's been previously owned. Is that okay? Did the person at the flea market load it with Trojan software? I don't know. Okay. If you did a factory reset, the manufacturer is still going to have a record that it was owned before. Are they going to issue a second voucher because for a different person because they say, hey, maybe the device is stolen, or maybe I don't support reselling? Well, that's something we didn't decide, but we're enabling all of those decisions if you want to make, the manufacturer wants to make them. I don't know if you're familiar with MUD. So I believe it's in IESG, Terry, do you know? I think it's fast IESG. Yeah. So this is a ops area submission. Manufacturer uses description specification and essentially allows a device such as a printer to say, I'm a printer and I have absolutely no business talking to an IRC network, right? At most, I will talk to this one host at one place to get my firmware updates, and everything else is nonsense. So please, Mr. Firewall, if you see anything suspicious, it's a problem. So that's something that I think is going to have some traction, and we have some integration back and forth where the MUD URL specifies our MASA, which is our manufacturer URL, and there's some connectivity back and forth there. As long as the router, the edge router, is going to acquire somehow the MUD information, well, in the process of doing that, you can essentially do all the enrollment as well at the same time. There's some manufacturer involvement. I think that's useful and important. I know it's so hard to get them to ship firmware, period, but if they're going to support any of these protocols that we're defining right now, I think that it's going to be helpful if we have ongoing involvement. We do have some push button type extensions where you could do some reduced operations, the whole I push 2 buttons and this kind of stuff. We wouldn't describe those mechanisms, the specifics of them, but rather how they fit into our protocol. Where do they go into the process? So there's a reduced security process. Next slide, please. So what's the challenges, right? So HomeNet is explicitly a non-professionally managed network. So in Anima, we said we only deal with professionally managed networks. And that was to exclude us trying to boil the ocean of the HomeNet problem as well. And so what is HomeNet's really problem is it's quote unprofessional. Is that the opposite of professionally managed, or amateur, or just is it unmanaged? It's, you can pick different words for that, but they have actually, the one that you probably matters is that if there's infrastructure required in the HomeNet, it's probably very hard to get it independently funded. Whereas in an enterprise, if someone says, to deploy these 1,000 phones, I need to have this infrastructure, this other system. People are like, oh yeah, okay, that's amortized over 1,000 phones. That's okay. It's cool. I got that, right? I need to have servers. I need to have backend. I need to have directory access, that stuff. But in the HomeNet, you're like, well, I just want some more disk space on my network. Why do I have to buy this other thing? I just want, better connectivity in the upper bedroom, right? Why am I buying anything else? So I think that's the real challenge, is getting this piece. And I think it's the same problem for the DNS and the other stuff, is how do we get that? And I know that's a layer 9 issue, and we're not supposed to talk about those sometimes, but if we don't know who's going to run the system, then I don't think we can design it properly. And I think that's really important. So is there a PKI? Is it randomly replaced because people just, pick equipment off the network and shove it in the garbage and buy something new, right? That happens, right? I don't like it. I watch people's perfectly good TVs go onto the curb that way. Well, what if the PKI was in their TV because that was the machine that had the best user interface, the biggest screen, right? And the TV doesn't leave the house. It's a really good place to put your PKI. It's not supposed to leave the house. All of your other devices are mobile, right? So maybe that's a problem. His and her JRCs, right? We had the example, Fred Baker's original document about, how he and his wife were not allowed on the same network and couldn't share the same printer because they worked for different companies and stuff like that. So we may get into that problem. Finally, we have the interactions with so-called smart home. So I think that's going to be a problem going forward. We're going to butt heads against the other people that also want to invade the home and do things and put infrastructure. And it might actually be good if we actually have an answer that says, well, actually, there's an IETF spec on how to do the rest of the stuff, and you're actually already doing it. So either you have your registrar, or the HomeNet has its, and you pick one or the other, and that's it. And everyone's happy at that point. So, and then it's possible to put the registrar in the cloud. I don't know exactly how to do it, but I have some ideas, and I think it could work. What's the next slide, please? I talked about that. Let's go on. So one idea is, you may have heard of the Hub of All Things. It was an attempt, or it is an attempt, to bring all of your IoT data in one place. They've, in the last 4 years, had some pragmatic things that they're now doing some other type of privacy, your private data collection, but they want to get back to this. And fundamentally, they want to put a box in everyone's home that collects everyone's their data for them, so that they own it rather than other people. So there may be some interesting places, some other movements where we would find that suddenly there's something interesting happens. Next slide. In your NAS, so the one on the top is one I have. It's a hard drive with a very, almost a thing that's just barely big enough for the bloody connector to the hard drive, and it operates as a NAS. You can buy these things now called GNU. Apparently it's going to change name because they don't like the name, but there's 5 or 6 kind of things like that. That's more than enough power to run a PKI or a DNS server or a bunch of other stuff. The question is, who's going to maintain it for the next 10 years, and how is that going to happen? Where's the revenue stream out of the home to get that paid for? And if it's not going to happen, then I don't think if we can't figure that out, then I don't think our technology will get deployed. Next slide, please. So what do I suggest we do? Lots of layer 9 problems. Well, you could help us finish the current work. Reviews are, of course, welcome. You could read it and see if we have must-nots that would upset you. That if you were going to apply the document, this would be a problem. Shoulds are not a big deal because, if you write a profile for HomeNet that says, do this, and we said you should, don't do this, and we said you should do that, I don't think that's a problem. Next slide. So we could write a profile of Brewski for HomeNet. I don't think it would be that hard because I've written a couple already. And I think we would have to make a couple decisions, like what kind of vouchers do we want, and that kind of thing. And I don't think I think it would be relatively easy to do it. And we could easily get to a point of doing something interesting at one of the hackathons. Whether it produces useful code for that could be shipped, different question. But we would have to decide a couple things about the joint proxy and some other stuff. And it's possible we don't need a joint proxy, that ultimately connectivity when the HomeNet the HomeNet is flat enough that it doesn't matter, but maybe that's not the case. Next slide. So what do you do if you're a Brewski happy HomeNet device and you get deployed in a network that doesn't have it yet? What is your fallback? How do you get connected? So you could go netconf zero touch call home. That's fully in our space and is really aimed at this kind of stuff. The only problem is if it works too well, no one will bother deploying their own public, their own stuff at home. And a lot of the stuff we'd like to have happen won't happen because the devices will all be still connected to the cloud. So we need to think a little bit about that if that's something we want to solve. Next slide. Questions?
Ted Lemon, thanks for preparing this, Michael. This was really great. I guess I'm curious. So I've had a little bit of experience with devices of the type that you're talking about on my HomeNet recently. I got a Wemo because I was kind of tired of Z-Wave not working, and it'd be interesting to talk about the various problems with the Wemo registration process and how this solves them. So I don't know if you've ever played with one of these devices, but when you get a Wemo, basically it creates a Wi-Fi network and you have to join it. And
oh yes, okay. So same with Chromecast and a bunch of other devices. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, with Chromecast it's kind of invisible, but I think.
First time you have to join its network, and then it will join yours.
Okay, I don't remember that anymore, but it's been a while. But anyway, that's how it was with the Wemo, and it was, it was kind of a pain. Does Anima provide a better answer to that problem than what Wemo did?
So, we actually have a document. There is a individual submission into Anima about 9 different ways to do Anima over Wi-Fi in a zero-touch way. Mm-hmm. To me, the most obvious way is you join the ESSID called Anima, which is unencrypted and do stuff, and then you get the right credentials and join the right network. Mm-hmm. But there's about 150 other 802.11 ways to skin this cat, and some people have decided to at least write them down so we can taste test them. So at the very least, that process that you went through with the Wemo would be the Wemo joining your network, whether it might not be your real network, but and that would be standard so that it would be real. And you wouldn't have to be, I need to disconnect my phone or my laptop from my network, join their network, figure it out. But now I can't read the manual because I don't have internet anymore. I have to switch back again. I went through that, right? Yeah. And I'm like, this doesn't work, whatever. So at least you would be interacting with your registrar to authorize it onto your network, and you wouldn't have to worry about connecting to it. So I think that would be an improvement over what's there. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's my take.
So this isn't really a question that you need to answer, but I'm asking it naively just in case you happen to know the answer. I know there's a thing called AOSS, which is a bit sucky in the sense that it uses ARC4. Is Anima doing something similar to that, or is the Anima network just like wide open? Because the way AOSS works is that it's only present when you enable it, so it's not just always sitting there.
I don't know what AOSS is, so I can't answer the question.
Okay.
Michael Abrahamson, if you go back one slide, just since I was talking about the stuff that is in OpenWRT. ZeroConf, zero touch, call home. So this is almost done, and this call home, there is already in OpenWRT, doesn't have many plugins, but there is already something you can install that does the call home.
So this is for the router to call its home, not for the router to facilitate other devices calling home, right?
So we were missing the NMS end of that. I don't want to say server and client because then people get confused.
Yes.
Tend to use NMS.
And for the router calling home part, right, there's also TR69 or 79, I can't remember which one it is, and that is also widely used. And it's not dissimilar, but it's very much only for the CPE to ISP state, right?
Yes. So I don't care about tier 69.
Yeah, I know you don't, exactly.
We don't have to talk about
You don't have to talk about it. All I'm saying is that
but I would like to say, if we're going to have multiple routers in the home, multiple devices, yes, this is one way of doing it. Also wanted to just comment on like the getting stuff at the flea market and so on. And I think we've seen that with mobile phones and so on, having vendor lock-in and someone owning it is crucial to stop theft and robberies and so on. But for home equipment, I'm not sure that the use cases there compared to the downsides of screwing it up. I mean, you can go to if you buy an expensive mobile phone, the vendor kind of supports you when you go there with your receipt and say, I would like this unlocked. But when you go there with your $30 or something else, I think the vendor is not going to care to try to transfer that voucher or ownership. So for this space, I would say, yeah, factory reset is factory reset.
right. So that's exactly. So I think that there's a wealth of different things, and I think we can write, we could write what are really layer 8 documents about, how this works, and that may be valuable. But for the moment, essentially we support whatever model the manufacturer wants to do, and you can also have the model that once it becomes your device, it's fully your device. You can load any firmware at all. If that's the model, then you become the manufacturer for the next guy you sell it to. Right.
Pierre Plister from Cisco. I'm sorry, I haven't read the draft yet. It's a bit long. And I'll go to that later. First, from the deployment and operational perspective, I think relying on the manufacturers to provide such service is a bit optimistic. I can understand how it will work when the manufacturer is Cisco and you paid multiple $1,000 for your device, so you have a very good support and people operating it are actually certified. They had hours of lessons to know how to do that. For someone in a home, I don't know, like you're supposed to buy your device, plug it in, and at that point the first assumption is that internet is already up because you need to call the manufacturer.
Right. Yeah.
If it's not, then the provider is going to have a call. And so either the manufacturer who sold the device $30 or the ISP who sells a service very low cost as well is going to have a call, and they don't want to have such calls. And then the second point is that we, a few years ago, like a couple of years ago, we had a proposal to secure HNCP. It was certainly not perfect, but it was implemented, and it was way shorter in terms of specification. So my worry is really that it's going to be your proposal, although working, would be very complex to implement, very complex to operate and deploy, too expensive.
So that's why I'm saying that there's a lot of the pieces that we've created don't and shouldn't exist. Secondly, bootstrapping the security for HNCP, that's what our goal is, not replacing the security. Just going backwards on what you said. Cisco, your company, ships phones with a system that works almost identical to this. And it's based on this, a lot of this concept is based on that. So at the phone level, now these are not, $20, SIP phones. These are $150 SIP phones. Well, at least that's the retail price, probably much less when you buy 1,000. So those are already doing that. And I think that the reason for doing that whole process is to reduce the support load of deploying that many devices. But you're absolutely right. So if you're going to call home, you need internet up. You need to be connected on the network. And that's the whole problem. We're trying to get the device connected enough such that we can actually talk to it enough to do something. So you're completely right. Call home totally fails if the only way to get on the network is Wi-Fi, and you need a password to get on the Wi-Fi, and there's no interface. So that's why we get into it creates its own network. But I think that it's possible to create things where it does work, and it works even though you bought the device at the flea market or through 6 different levels of reseller. Okay, I live in a branch plant country where whatever number of resellers there are in the US, we always have 3 more layers. to lose our sales receipts, right? So that's the problem, is it's very hard to get a relationship with the manufacturer directly. And so we have a number of proposals to make that work, such that the manufacturer doesn't have to take those those support calls, because we eliminate them, I hope.
So just to clarify before I let the other people speak, the draft I was talking about was taking care of the bootstrapping as well. I would suggest that you explain, maybe in a further presentation or draft, I don't know, how this could work with something as simple as a password, or, as you mentioned, a button to press, because for now it doesn't look to me that it's sufficiently simple to be used for any kind of user.
Okay.
Hello, Max Stuckey from Ripon CC. So I wanted to add just a comment to what Michael has already said about buying devices from the flea market, or actually considering devices that could be secondhand. You have to remember that there's a lot of operators, lots of places where people cannot afford to get new devices. So you have complete markets where even the national incumbent distributes secondhand devices that they bought from other places.
Right.
And I think trying to solve the issue of being able to reuse a device in other contexts is crucial here, because otherwise we put the people in the hand of the vendors.
So let's say I'm an ISP and I buy 1,000 WRT equivalents from the market, right? So I hope, tell me if I'm wrong, that they're going to put them through a thing and put known firmware on them, right? Are they or not? I mean, because the end user won't know the password otherwise, right? How does that get configured?
Thing is, you never know.
Well, but the point is that if you don't at least go through a factory reset so that so that they can actually ship it and give it to the user, well, if you've done that, then you could load your own anchor, right? Yeah, okay. And potentially this process would allow them to automate this, so they would actually be able to more easily buy the devices, and then they ship them out to the customer, who power cycles them, maybe does a sort of factory reset, but now it's booting their image, right? Mm-hmm. And enrolled. And then, I mean, we have, of course, the question, which I don't think we resolved in HomeNet, which is, you know, do the CPE devices belong to the homeowner or the ISP, or do they have two minds, right? And it doesn't matter to me, to my protocol, how it works, but it does matter which credential the device winds up with, right?
Okay, thanks.
Stuart
Cheshire from Apple. I find this whole discussion a little bit puzzling.
Okay.
It almost feels like it's a parallel universe where the facts are different.
Okay.
When I looked at Adama a couple of years ago, there was this weird reaction, which is we're going to pretend that DNS service discovery doesn't exist, and imagine how we would solve this if that didn't exist.
Well, you actually can find our proxies with DNS service discovery. Okay.
Okay. I don't go into rabbit hole on that. The issue we're talking about now about how you provision new devices maybe was an unsolved problem 5 years ago, but now Nest is making thermostats and smoke detectors, and Belkin's making the Wemo, and Apple has the whole HomeKit line of third-party things, and it kind of seems like we're acting as if this is a big mysterious thing no one knows how to do, but you walk down the high street, you can come back with an armful of products that are already doing this, and I don't stand here for 10 minutes sort of explaining how they all work, but there are some that use the Bluetooth radio as a way of doing the provisioning. There are some that work the way Ted described, where the device acts as its own access point. There is work that we're looking at Apple about maybe being able to support joining two access points on the radio. That's not a product announcement. That's just something we've been looking at, because that's just a matter of time slicing the Wi-Fi radio to do double duty. There are also peer-to-peer wireless technologies where you can exchange frames with a peer. That is kind of an IEEE layer problem to solve that usability. It's not a fundamental protocol issue. How you do the secure bootstrapping with the appropriate kind of encrypted key exchange. The thread group is doing a ton of interesting work about how you enroll new devices onto the network. So it seems like we should at least not be ignoring all of that existing stuff and pretending it doesn't exist.
So actually, we're doing the complete opposite, okay? Which is we would very much like to reference all the thread group work, but there are multiple people in the IETF whose lawyers won't let them see the documents because that is not an open standard. I don't know about the IPR and the Apple HomeKit. I haven't looked. I do remember reading overviews. The WeMo is a obvious way to do it, and you mentioned a whole bunch of other things. So what you're really doing is saying this is a really good idea. Everyone's already done it. Well, let's do it at the IETF in a standardized way, such that we don't have 19 ways of doing it. As for the IEEE, the frame things and all that stuff, yeah. So I mentioned we have this document that is an individual submission at this point. How to find the right network to enroll for Wi-Fi, and as I said, there are about 9 different IEEE ways to do this.
One of the common mechanisms is using the camera as a communication channel. There's
absolutely, and
you point it at the device, and there's a serial number, and it reads it.
Absolutely, those are all really good things to do, and I'm not saying, and they're not excluded, was what I'm trying to say. But there are many different ways of doing things, and the point of this is, do we want to have a way that allows you to manage all of your devices regardless of their origin? In other words, that's what we usually do with the IETF, right? Cisco could implement their own EGP, and Juniper could have one, and we could have 2 internets. But we don't like that, right? We like one. So that's why we're here. So I would love to have all that kind of technology come into it. But what I'm seeing is that everyone prefers to have their own vertical and their own thing. And I would love to include whatever I can. There's one of the proxy mechanisms, stateless proxy mechanisms. I would love to use threads mechanism. Okay. It's not easy to reference. Like, it's not even easy to get the document, let alone to tell people how do you do it.
Just on that last topic, I don't know why people have been advised by their lawyers to remain ignorant. The thread specifications, and it's big, it's 700 pages.
Yep.
I should be clear, Apple is not currently a member of the thread group, so we have no special status or influence there. But I went to the web page and I downloaded the specification, and the only restriction on that, it's a fairly short, effectively end-user license agreement. It says, but I understand that downloading this specification does not give me a license to use the technology in it and sell products with the thread group trademark. To do that, you need to join, but to read the specifications, there's no restriction.
The IPR, the click-through that you went through was a bit more onerous, apparently. I did what you did, right? But it very, very strongly cautioned me against giving my copy of the document to you or letting you see it. It was watermarked with my name, right? So
it sounds like you've been through the same process,
yeah.
And it's certainly not an open standard the way an IETF RFC can be shared.
Right.
And I'm not here defending the thread group, but it is not as onerous as it sounds like some people are making it out to be.
I would really prefer to reuse particular pieces of their technology for particular things. And it would be lovely to, as you said, we have to become a member of the thread group if we want to call it that. But there's some bits and pieces that would be really nice to reuse because, there's just facilities that may be elsewhere. So devices that could operate in thread space or not.
Bob, I'll switch to HG Consulting. Probably can answer some of the things that Stuart was implying here. I was at the beginning of this process in IEEE 802.1 back in 2003, maybe 2004. 802.1 AR was published in 2006. That gave us the root and the basic structure here. But then there was, now that we got this concept of device certificates, what do we do with them? And that turned it over to the IETF at that time. It's taken the IETF, unfortunately, a little bit of time to get moving on it and get it done. The goal here is to have something which is consistent and open and not a whole bunch of verticals and a whole bunch of industry groups. And they can adopt a lot of this. One of the things that we're also doing here in the IETF is that we're trying to push this down even into smaller devices. This is the work in COSI that we're doing, and trying to get lighter sort of certificate of security claim things that can put it even to smaller type devices. But how do you consistently non-industry specific? Because in 2015, I worked with one vendor and to create their proprietary architecture on their 8-bit processor with 32K of memory. So it's, how do we create something which is open, standardized, built on concepts which can scale all the way up to the systems with TPMs, which have true trust anchors in the TPM, versus down to smaller things which have some sort of secure store for that private key and how to build it. This is, it has unfortunately typical IEEE and IETF slow plotting work that industry forum don't like because they got to sell something. But if we can now start moving toward convergence in that regard, and taking these concepts here, the intent here was that there is resale, that I can pick up that microwave on my neighbor's curb and take that microwave and it'll properly join my network, throw out all my neighbor's information, and now become mine. And if there's still warranty, whatever, the microwave manufacturer will know that I now have that the possession of that microwave, because you have that root of trust of the ownership of the manufacturer and the certificate in. So this, and I was also say one final thing, that why we did this in 2003. We had the Cisco gentleman and talking about VoIP. It was Cisco and Aruba who got so badly burned with their firmwares and configuration files being overwritten and the attacks against them, no way to validate them, that the original 802.1ar driver was Cisco and Aruba, that we had to do something back then. But it has been, unfortunately, such a long time coming. And but I think we're now to the point where we have a full ecosystem which can really benefit. And now it's the challenge of the IETF, hopefully, to get the broad adoption, to get all these different enclaves to say, well, how do we get to a standardized approach?
So HomeNet is the most difficult enclave because, you know, in the enterprise ISP anima space, we know there's a management, and they have a very strong relationship with their suppliers to be able to do things with them. In the 6-dish space, it's IoT, but it's industrial IoT, where again there is a very, very strong relationship and a sales channel force to make things happen. And so we knew we could solve certain problems that way. So HomeNet is this essentially Wild West, right? You go to any manufacturer, including the curb, and hope something to work. So it's the most challenging space, and it's frankly the way we stayed away from it. We said, look, we can't solve your problems. It's just going to be boiling the ocean. But at this point, we have a couple of ships that you might want to consider, okay, in your ocean trek, and they may or may not help you. All right.
I think it really can make. I have a strongly biased view in terms of my home network, since I set down my first breadboard back in 1961. So I may not be your typical home user. This is my first transistors I got back then. But I really think, again, I'm biased. I've been involved in this process for, a long time, and that this is can be of immense value. And once we start doing it, vendors will say, oh, all these claims about how I do security and how I get started with it, there's something I can adopt to do it with.
Yeah, I think it was the most valuable part. Julius, you closed the mic lines or what? Did you?
Julius Krobacek, well, you got some pretty strong reactions about the secure boot issue. And when reasonable people disagree and everybody is acting in good faith, it usually means that they are making different assumptions.
True.
And that those assumptions should be written out. And I think the assumption you're making here is that the vendor and the user have aligned interests, or in other words, that the vendor has the user's best interests in mind, which is usually the case, especially among the vendors present in this room. But it might be the case, hypothetically, that the vendor is interested in planned obsolescence, that the vendor is interested in vendor lock-in, okay, and that is what worries people here. So I think this assumption should be spelled out.
Right, I agree with you.
The second point I'd like to make is that we are living in a world in which free software, open source software is becoming increasingly important. And I think all of us are struggling to make sure that IETF and open standards remain relevant in a world in which anyone can just, throw their protocol in GitHub and be done with it. And secure boot has a very, very bad reputation.
So you keep saying secure boot, and this is not secure boot. This is secure bootstrap. I'm not talking about the devices coming up.
Of course.
Right. So just want to be clear. You said that, and secure boot is a different thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Just.
I think we're speaking of the same thing. Whether you're booting an OS or whether you're bootstrapping your network, doing it securely is pretty much the same problem.
I agree they are very related, but I think they're very different pieces, different problems because of what you just said, the interests of the vendor and the firmware maker and the influence of open source and things like this. I think there's a very different situations for the bootstrap versus the boot. So
if you allow me to conclude, the fact that here what you're doing is proposing that the vendor has a say in how you use the device even years afterwards is something that is a very good way to make sure that in the free software community, IETF appears like the tool of the vendors trying to regain control of an internet that the vendors no longer control.
I totally get you.
This is not something that we want
I totally get you, and I think you're completely correct about that concern and that potential space. And to be honest, it keeps me awake at night. I think, am I acting for the devil here? And I think, how can I moderate how can I make options such that users still have some control and retain ownership of their devices, and yet it's easy, right? So I get what you're saying, Julius. Okay, I really get it, and I think it is a major tussle, and I don't have a solution to it.
Okay, I think we need to get towards wrapping this up. So if you can be brief, Bob, please.
I'll just real quickly. We discussed this, and we thought we discussed this back in 2004. This is if we had this trust of anchor by the manufacturer, because this is the way to bootstrap it. Sometimes you don't want that. So the implicit part of the LDEV ID is that if you have a different mechanism in which to enroll that does not use the IDEV ID, and it's kind of in here, you can then use the LDEV ID totally independent of the IDEV ID. But this is something that they will have to do. It's not precluded necessarily from the technology, but it's this whole thing of how do I get a trusted boot? I have to go back to the manufacturer. And that becomes a hard social problem.
So thank you for your time. And then you had another section on this, right?
Okay. So the other thing we had was,
what do we now do with security?
So this is the mail I sent to the list some time ago, and I guess the first part was about the simple naming, so that work will go ahead. We had this milestone in our charter about a perimeter security draft. Nobody has said they are in a position where they're willing or able to offer texts.
Sorry, quick point, David Scanazzi. Can you move that window a little bit to the right? Because it's being projected on the curtain, so we can't read it.
Pardon me?
Thank you so much.
Better? Perfect. Okay. Thanks for the fix. Okay, so we had this perimeter security draft milestone. As of now, we had a chat and we talked to the RID, and I guess the feeling is if we don't have somebody who's going to do it, then it's not going to happen. So again, if you're in a position to be able to do this, then it'd be good to know. Hi, Ted.
Hi, Ted Lemon. Yeah, I'm in a position to be able to do this and would like to.
Okay. And I actually forget what the date on the milestone is, but milestone dates are always stupid. Is that something you'd be able to do like in the same kind of time period you mentioned earlier where you'll be?
Obviously the simple HomeNet naming architecture comes first, but I think that they're related. And so it's good to do a little bit of parallelism there. So yeah.
Okay. So that sounds like we don't totally give up on this is the state we're in.
That's my hope, yes.
Okay, if anybody else feels inspired to kind of work on this, then please let Barbara and I know or write a draft and send it to the list. But I think barring somebody turning up a text, we're going to assume that this milestone might not happen. Nobody wants to go to the mic to dispute that? Okay. And then the third thing was... that on HACCP and Babel, there's some work ongoing in the Babel working group on DTLS and or other things. Maybe it'd be nice to get an update on anything that happened there this week.
So in Babel, we have two approaches to security. One is simple symmetric keying using HMAC. And the other one is David's idea, which uses DTLS. So they have different trade-offs. HMAC is something simple, something that you have a chance to review before you retire. While in the case of DTLS, you make crypto somebody else's problem by pushing it into DTLS, and you get all the features of DTLS. Both are happening right now. There is a BIS for the HMAC that is being worked on, and we are planning to do an implementation this summer. And we have two non-interoperable proof of concept implementations of the DTLS stuff. And there are just two bits literally that are in disagreement between the two implementations, one being by David, one by Antona. So this stuff is without any, and I don't know if there's consensus, but I feel that there is, shall we say, rough agreement on the fact that HMAC should be the strongly recommended and DTLS the optional protocol. So both of those things are advancing. Both of these things are being worked on, and I'm confident that we will have implementations and drafts by the end of the summer for the right definition of summer. You know, sometimes summer lasts until March next year.
So would it be fair to say that work in this group should really kind of hold and see how that matures a little bit more towards the summer?
No, not at all.
Okay.
We know exactly what's going to happen. We know exactly what it's going to look like, and the home network should proceed now.
Okay.
Simply because the proof of concepts are good enough to work with.
Okay. So then a question that we'll be facing is, if there are these two mechanisms, do we want to prefer one or another, or just?
Are you happy with just auth and just symmetric keying or not? That's the main question. If you are, then HMAC is fine.
If I could suggest,
yeah.
Sorry. Another question would be: are we happy with Babel making the decision as to which is mandatory to implement?
In HomeNet?
Mandatory to implement on Babel, and it just is inherited.
David Skenazy, Apple, I don't think what is mandatory to implement in the Babel working group is necessarily important here. I think the profile for HomeNet should define what we're using for HomeNet, because we've been building flexible things in Babel. So if your use case has a single symmetric key for everyone, we can do that. If your use case has a certificate per router, we can do that. I think HomeNet needs to define the kind of the root of trust, and that was great previous conversation. Once we have that, then you can pick which Babel security mechanism you want and say that is a must implement for HomeNet. But to echo what Julius said, we should still make progress into defining that. What kind of keys do we have? How do we get them in HomeNet? Because, yeah, the progress we need to make in Babel are like, we're talking like mundane disagreements like port numbers. They're completely irrelevant to the security discussion, so we should keep forging ahead in HomeNet to decide how we're going to key this.
Okay.
Pierre, I think based on what Julius just said, we are in a great position to work with Babel. I'm very happy with the HBAC option because we have, the working group needs to focus on securing HNCP anyway, or improve the security that is already defined in the existing document. From that standpoint, it's a piece of cake to just create a key that is shared between the nodes using HNCP, propagate that key using HNCP, and provision Babel with that key. Whenever there is a node that would need to be to leave the network because it has been compromised, we can generate a new key.
Ted Lemon. So I guess what I think I just heard is that we've abandoned the idea of doing pairwise symmetric keying.
DTLS gives you that. With DTLS, you get whatever your DTLS implementation is able to do.
Okay. So we are doing DTLS, which gives us that.
But Ted, maybe you're taking somebody's comment and assuming that that is something that has consensus as opposed to just an individual comment.
Right, yeah. No, that's what I'm asking. That's why I'm asking.
But I'm talking about the way you asked, not really what you asked.
Pierre, again, we have not gave up on asymmetric keying, but maybe we can give it up on Babel and leave it to HNCP. Like authentication can be in HNCP and just encryption in Babel.
Right. So that's actually kind of what I was getting at is that when we talked about this. So if you do the asymmetric keys in HNCP, then you can allocate pairwise symmetric keys using HNCP for Babel. But if Babel doesn't support pairwise symmetric keys, then you can't use them.
No, it supports.
Not pairwise, network-wise.
Well, what's the point of that? Then you don't have security.
As I explained before, if there is a new node or if there is a node that needs to leave the network, you change the key.
So the problem with that is that we don't actually. So what you actually said before was if there is a node that needs to leave the network, or if there is a node that's been compromised, then you need to generate a new key. But how do you know that a node has been compromised if you only have one key?
So that's a problem we need to solve in HNCP anyway.
But you can't solve that problem for Babel in HNCP.
David Skenazy, Apple. To answer Ted's question, no, we're not ruling anything out. As the exchange just proved, we need to figure this out. We have quite a few options. We have HNCP and Babel that are very flexible. So let's keep thinking about this and figure one out.
So who is willing to be actively involved in that trying to figure this out and pick some options? So I only saw two people raise their hand. Is that the only two? Is it okay? Three?
I'm interested.
Yeah, no, well, I guess. So I guess we should have some mail discussion amongst those people to try and, not as a design team, but we'll just, let's say, just have a few people have a chat and see, can they initially come to some proposal and then bring it to the list?
So just a little note of history here. At, I believe, the Singapore IETF, in fact, I know it was the Singapore IETF, name blank failure.
Some person.
Apple security guy, Chris Wood. Thank you. I'm terrible with names. I mean, anyway. So Chris actually wrote a document that talks about how to do pairwise symmetric keying, and incidentally, TLS. Of course, TLS was already there, but that was kind of there was a little bit of a clash in terms of goals there, but there was actual work done to solve the pairwise symmetric keying problem that got. I think the outcome of that was that we concluded that it had been unnecessary. But it sounds like because Babel already had that, but now it sounds like Babel doesn't already have that, so maybe we should revive that document.
Julius?
I have a slight feeling of déjà vu here when we are speaking about HNCP security. I would suggest that perhaps the discussion would be more productive if it happened around code.
I agree.
So of the three people who said that they were kind of actively interested in this, I think some of you at least have some code, right? So I would hope that last hint is something that it would be the case, no?
Yes.
In that case, Ted mentioned a draft he has. I think we would like to see an implementation. What Julius was saying is we would like to see an implementation of that draft to know more about how it actually pans out.
Right. So Chris's draft actually used symmetric key for broadcast and asymmetric key for everything else, and didn't really talk about the HNCP part of the equation. So the HNCP stuff is still work I've been talking about doing, but then life happened and it hasn't actually occurred. But we need to actually have symmetric keys working in HNCP and have a way to use symmetric keys to develop asymmetric keys working in HNCP, and then have a way to develop pairwise symmetric keys using HNCP, which we don't, I think, currently have, unless I'm vastly mistaken. Pierre, shake your head, or am I? We don't have it right now, right? Asymmetric keys used to generate pairwise symmetric keys. Well, that would be for using DTLS in HNCP. Those are session keys.
So doing the design at the mic line is probably not going to be that productive.
Okay.
So, I mean, I guess the chairs will try and take action to get those three people in a huddle and see if there's an agreement that to bring to the mailing list. And I think having it based on code, as Julia suggests, would be really good. So it mightn't be very immediate, but I think making some decisions in this space seems like a sensible thing to do. Yeah. Any other comment on that topic? So we have a couple of victims to try and victimize. And I think that's pretty much it. So I think we're at the any other business part of the agenda. Is there any other business? Gone. Thank you.